Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Xander. Welcome to the Center for Civic Engagement's office hours in partnership with, I saw some colleagues from the alumni office enter in. Hi. Thank you for your help. Thank you for your partnership. If you are familiar with office hours, welcome back. It's good to have you back. If you're new to office hours, it's an attempt to talk about some hot topics, some things that are happening either in the United States or across the globe with faculty experts. And we have three of them here today, my colleagues from the political science department. My name is Dave Dulio. I'm a professor in the poli-sci department, and I'm the director of the Center for Civic Engagement, which along with the Alumni Association, the Office of Alumni Engagement actually, sponsors these office hours events. I've got with me today, as I said, three colleagues from political science, Christian Cantier, Pete Trumbore, and Paul Kubicek. And we're going to tackle international affairs, many aspects of it, not all aspects, many. And if you're unfamiliar with the way these work, the faculty don't make presentations. We just ask them questions. The idea is to treat it like office hours that you would have as students with your professors in courses that you're currently taking, or if you're watching via Zoom and you're an alum, to harken back to the days when you were on campus and you went to office hours and asked your professors questions. So I'll start off by asking them a handful of questions, and then we invite the audience to ask. You're certainly able to do so via Zoom, and please put those in the chat and we'll get to those. If you're here when we turn to audience questions, raise your hand and we'll recognize you and let you ask your question. So we got a lot to get to, but let me start here for you fellas. First of all, thank you for being here and giving your time for this. If folks are following the news, they know about Ukraine, Russia, China, the big flashpoints, right? But what else are you all watching? What else should other people pay attention to on the international stage these days? We'll have plenty of time to talk about those three big ones, but what are you guys watching?
Well, here's one that's kind of out of left field, unless you've been paying attention to Canada-India relations. Canada has accused the Indian government of complicity in the assassination of a Sikh separatist leader who was living in Canada. And they have expelled each other's diplomats. And so this is a really interesting development that, is embroiled two close friends and allies of the United States. So that's sort of the obscure one that caught my attention over the last week or so.
In addition to that, I'm really interested in the Canada-India thing as well. I would say that I'm keeping an eye on what's been going on in Iran. It doesn't necessarily garner the headlines, but the protests there that have been ongoing sort of off and on have been brutally repressed by the government. I think that the potential for change in Iran is real. It's something that we haven't seen, this sort of grassroots protest for some time in that country. And, we know that Iran, causes trouble with its nuclear weapons program or other sorts of issues. But I think the prospect for regime change there is something to keep an eye on.
Other than those things, I'm following the ongoing war in the Sudan. It's one of the events that hasn't gotten a lot of media attention. I'm also following the presidential election in Mexico. Mexico will most likely have its first female president in 2024. That's another really big issue to follow. So yeah, those are the kind of the two big things.
Great, thanks. And for folks just walking into the Winter Garden area here in the Oakland Center, feel free to pull up some chairs. Chris Reed from the Oakland Center won't get too mad as long as we put him back, right, Chris? So let's start with Paul's mention of Iran. What would it take for regime change there? And can you address the recent U.S.-Iran deal, not the Iran deal, but the swap.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we've seen some of these things happen before, and there's certainly no guarantee that popular protests are going to succeed, right? I mean, we can be hopeful and think that the people rising up and that they will inevitably the government's going to collapse. But the Iranian regime has proven time and time again it's willing to use very brutal force against those that oppose it. It doesn't mean though that this is always going to succeed on their end either. So it takes a lot of bravery, obviously, for people to rise up when they face the possibility of prison or worse for doing so. But the regime, I think a lot of these authoritarian regimes that we see that look strong, they're brittle. They can collapse by enough people getting out on the streets or a turning point or having regime insiders decide that enough is enough or that it's, the time is come for something new. I don't know if Iran is at that point yet, but clearly we're seeing demands for change from Iran, and we know that the people there want something different, but they've been unable to achieve that. The Iran deal, I mean, unfortunately, I would say in this case, unfortunately, it's in all likelihood getting the money is probably going to help the regime prop up, or deal with some of its economic problems. And I think the regime is on the defensive and looking for, it knows it has real problems and therefore was willing to cut this sort of deal. And they did profit, financially from this, clearly.
For those that weren't following it as closely, what was part of the deal?
Well, the deal was that they were going to get, it was money that they had. It wasn't, we aren't giving them money, but we're unfreezing assets that we had frozen over the course of time they'd earned through oil trade and other sorts of stuff that had been frozen in U.S. banks will now be available to them, transferred to them. So we're not giving them money, but we're giving them access to the money that we had frozen.
And what do we get back in return?
We got back what, five Americans who were taken hostage there.
I think there's also, something else to be paying attention to in this whole dynamic, and that is a very strong desire on the part of the United States to bring Iran back into some sort of framework similar to what was agreed in 2015 around Iran's nuclear programs. The Iranians don't believe the United States is serious. And in part, this is a consequence of the decision that the Trump administration made in 2018 to essentially walk away from the whole thing. And so right now, the position of the Iranians is that the United States needs to do a lot more to demonstrate that we are serious about coming back to the table before they will entertain the prospects of entering back into some kind of multilateral framework around that nuclear program.
Christian, you mentioned the election in Mexico. What kind of implications will this election and potentially the election of the first female president in Mexico, what implications are there for the United States in that decision by the Mexican people?
It's a great question. It's kind of outside of my area of expertise. So I don't know if any of the
nobody knows that. Don't tell them that.
Right. From the things that I followed, the particularly the impact of a female president in 2024, I think is going to be very symbolic, right? As kind of gender equality has been a very important issue that has come up in both global South and the global North, and from a symbolic standpoint, I think it's something that's very meaningful to a lot of voters and to a lot of the electorate in the country. What the impact of this will be for U.S. Foreign policy, I'm not as certain, not as well trained in Mexican politics, but I suspect that the kind of the harmonization of the elections in both of these countries is going to make 2024 very entangled, I would imagine. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of Mexico, it is kind of interesting. I think a key issue always for the United States is trying to get more cooperation out of the Mexican government on issues that are important to us, primarily migration and narcotics trafficking. And so I think that that would be the outcome that we would want to see would be the election of a government that would be more cooperative in terms of U.S. interests. But also interesting about this in this 2024 dynamic, we have leading candidates on the Republican side of the field who have vowed to invade Mexico should they win the presidency. And that's a, you know, a bit of a head scratcher for me, but apparently it plays well with some parts of the Republican electorate.
And what is there a candidate that would more likely, candidate in Mexico that would more likely align with U.S. interests than another that's seeking the presidency?
Again, not an expert in the Mexican
Fair
electoral
enough.
system. However, I think there is a great deal of frustration with the current administration and what is perceived to be a lack of genuine cooperation, perennial problems of corruption and things like that. So.
Okay, so that's a great scan of other hot topics across the globe. Let's talk a bit about the one that is maybe front and center, at least mostly so for a U.S. audience, right? In part because President Zelensky of Ukraine is here. He is meeting with both the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate today. I don't believe he is giving a speech. Well, they've got a room in the basement of the Capitol where they're going to meet with him. Certainly not the grand stage of the old chamber or the House chamber, the current House chamber. But I guess I would ask you all to address the current state of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then talk a bit about how that's playing here in the U.S.
I'll go ahead and start. I would just say, since we probably last did one of these events, we talked about Ukraine's counteroffensive, which was going to happen in the spring or the summer once the conditions allowed it. And Ukraine had obviously received a lot of arms from Western countries and seemed, there was hope anyway, that was poised to make major military gains against Russian forces. We found out that Russian forces had dug themselves in fairly well on the front lines, and that the Ukrainians have made some progress, but it's been quite modest compared to maybe what the hopes might have been. So any hopes for any sort of major military breakthrough this year, and we're already nearing, you know, winter, so we're Ukrainian winter, so it's unlikely you're going to see a major change in this, that the stalemate is going to continue, and the war therefore seems likely to continue as well. And the question becomes, how long can the Ukrainians sort of hold out and continue to have this hope that they're going to make any sort of meaningful gains on the field? They certainly hope that. They have some capability to inflict damage on the Russians, but the big question, and it's one of the reasons, of course, why Zelensky's in Washington, is how long are they going to be able to continue to get a lot of supplies from Western governments? How long will the U.S. continue to aid them, and to what extent? How long will Europe continue to aid them, to what extent? And we can talk about this, but clearly I think that Zelensky is quite aware that his fate, or the fate of his country, may very well be determined by American voters next November, which is something that I think makes them, the Ukrainians know that the clock is kind of ticking on their side.
You know, I think they're, you see, I think primarily in the House of Representatives with Republicans, certainly the most conservative members of the Republican caucus in the House, who are increasingly resistant and stand in opposition to continuing funding for the war in Ukraine, let alone increasing that funding and increasing the flow of supplies. So that's a really interesting, I think, political dynamic that we have to watch. It also sort of reminds us that the upcoming elections in 2024 really are pretty high stakes in the United States when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. We don't often think about American presidential elections as being all that momentous. But I think the reality is, especially as we're moving into the next election cycle, that there could be some significant changes in U.S. priorities, significant changes in U.S. alliance relationships, U.S. standing around the world, and things like that, depending upon the outcome of that election. So, you know, for me, that's one of the more interesting things to be watching in terms of how the war in Ukraine is playing out, and especially the way it's playing politically in the United States. There's other stuff about the conduct of the war that are really interesting that I'm also paying attention to. And one of those is the increasing prevalence and central role that drones are playing. And that represents, in a lot of ways, a revolution in military technology and in both strategic and tactical use of weapons that is going to be meaningful moving forward, not just Ukraine, but in other battlefields around the world.
Before you jump in there, Christian, did I hear you right? And you said that we often don't think of U.S. presidential elections as being all that momentous?
Yeah, I did say that. And I think it's true. If you look at the way people vote, they don't vote on foreign policy issues. And there's also a real sort of momentum and inertia when it comes to American foreign policy. The sort of the broad trends in U.S. foreign policy are remarkably consistent administration to administration. They tend to differ on the margins, right? But in a lot of ways, the last 8 years have shown us that, especially in foreign policy, and that's what I pay most attention to, elections both at the presidential level, but also at the congressional level, have real consequences for foreign policy that I think voters haven't really appreciated historically.
On Ukraine more specifically, I would add that I'm cautiously optimistic about how Ukraine is doing and resisting the Russian invasion. One of the unknowns, I think, in the next few months to a year is the impact of new assistance that the Ukrainians have received. F-16 training, for instance. We haven't seen the full consequence of that yet on the battlefield. I think for that reason, Ukrainian leaders are also themselves fairly optimistic in this regard, and they have a kind of a long-term plan for resisting Russian aggression that I don't think they're thinking in weeks or months, right? As some Western analysts might be expecting, they're thinking years, perhaps decades. With respect to Russia more specifically, I do think there's concern in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe and in general about the extent to which Russia will continue to be ostracized and isolated. Western countries, the US and the European Union, have been fairly effective thus far. It is no diplomatic feat for Vladimir Putin to beg for assistance from the leader of North Korea. That's not a particularly impressive foreign policy achievement. Having said that, however, I think we're seeing some kind of breaks in the wall of kind of ostracism or isolation that we kind of imposed after Russia invaded. I think the global South is an example there. So Russia does still have a lot of support across the world. There's also the question of how much Western countries are going to continue to participate in the policy of isolation. There are certainly political forces inside the United States, as you've mentioned, and Western Europe that tend to be more pro-Russian, or at least are now pushing Ukraine towards some sort of resolution that would involve territorial concessions.
Are those territorial concessions, are those even on the table for Ukraine? I mean, is that do you think that that's something they are actively considering, or at some point will have to actively consider?
My impression is that they're not, right? So Ukraine wants to reclaim its internationally recognized territory. This includes Crimea, and I don't think that they are willing to discuss territorial concessions, or I don't even think Zelensky would be able to discuss territorial concessions in light of how unpopular this kind of policy would be. So I think for the Ukrainians themselves, I think that's a non-starter. I think there's also fear, not only in Ukraine, but across Europe as well, that concessions to Russia at this point would send the wrong signal. So any sort of desire to negotiate or to discuss with an invading army, I think will create a very dangerous precedent. There's also concern that Russia never follows through on its promises, and consequently, whatever treaty or agreement Russia signs, I believe inside Russia will be perceived as weakness in Ukraine and the West. So I think there's an awareness of that issue.
Yeah, I would say that you could imagine that the average Ukrainian at some point may decide that, that the costs of the war are high on the country, for sure, and that they would prefer to live in peace. And all things being equal, you could say, well, why don't they strike a peace deal? I think the key factor here is that the war criminal currently ruling the Kremlin has made maximal claims on Ukrainian territory. And it would be hard to imagine any Ukrainian leader sitting down across from that individual and striking any sort of deal, given what Russian claims on Ukraine are. Russia has annexed, in its view, a territory it doesn't even occupy. So from the Russian point of view, Russia would go to the table demanding Ukraine retreat from a lot of the territory that it has won back at great cost. And it seems right now quite a non-starter. And we can debate who holds, the better cards in terms of a long play on this. But it's going to be a long play. It's not something that's going to resolve itself this year, probably next. There will be pressure on the Ukrainians at some point, probably to reach out and make some sort of compromises. But I don't see war criminal Putin making any sort of compromises on his side.
And I just want to reiterate a point that I've made, I think, in all of the panel discussions that I've been part of about the war in Ukraine. And that is, as long as each side believes that they can achieve their goals on the battlefield, they don't have any incentive to come to the table. And at this point, that's what we are looking at. As far as I can tell, both the Ukrainians and the Russians believe that victory is attainable. And as long as that is your starting point, then your incentive to negotiate is pretty minimal. Now, there are things that in particular, Ukraine's allies could do that could change that calculation. We could, if we so chose, we could force Ukraine to the table by holding out the prospect of denying further assistance.
Who's we?
The Ukraine's allies, the United States principally, but others could as well, right? I don't see any evidence right now that is something that at least that this administration is interested in. But those are cards that third parties have to play if the desire was to simply end the fighting, regardless of what the terms of that peace might look like.
So Professor Trumbore mentioned a few minutes ago the I'll say increasing opposition in the U.S. House among the Republican conference for additional aid to Ukraine. There's also increasing, not opposition, but increasing doubt maybe among the public about the usefulness of spending money, sending aid to Ukraine. And I think that ties in with your point about next year's elections, right? That if this is an issue and that trend keeps going, those election results are likely not going to be to the benefit of the Ukraine aid proponents, right? So where does the public fall into that calculation? And is that confidence that you mentioned about thinking they can win, how dependent on the U.S. and maybe the U.S. public, how dependent is that outcome on those factors?
I don't think they're dependent upon the U.S. public. They are dependent upon the United States and the leadership of the United States to maintain this broad coalition that supports Ukraine. Look, the fact that you have some folks in the public who are skeptical about American assistance to Ukraine doesn't mean that when it comes time to practice, their sort of political perspectives at the ballot box, that's going to factor into the calculation that they make, right? I don't think anyone is going to switch votes over the Ukraine issue. Now, if you have candidates who are able to persuasively make the case that U.S. funding, U.S. spending to support Ukraine is directly coming at the expense of, I don't know, Medicare or veterans assistance or programs that Americans care about that they want to benefit from. If you could persuasively make that case to the American voter that we're taking money out of your pocket and giving it to these foreigners, then that can change the calculation for some voters. But I don't believe that's plausible.
But don't you think this is somewhat, I think a lot of this is disingenuous. A lot of the aid that we're giving, we're not writing them a check out of the US Treasury. What's happening is we are supplying weapons, and you know that US defense contractors are making a lot of money off of this Ukraine conflict. And if you believe the argument, which was bandied about largely by Republicans, that defense spending is somehow good for the economy, then you can make the argument that producing weapons and sending them to Ukraine is a benefit to the United States. I don't see it. I think that this is sort of a false choice that's being presented here. And what disturbs me, frankly, is that sure, you can make an economic argument about this, or you can make an argument of the efficacy of the aid and that it's really not doing what it's supposed to do, and maybe we need to, do something different. That's fair enough, I suppose. But my concern is that there's an ideological argument here, in that it's not just skepticism about Ukraine. There's a pro-Russian, pro-Putin element that is significant enough that can sway and change policy.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would not for a minute make the case that this is an honest argument or an honest debate that we're hearing on this question of funding when we should be funding American priorities. I think there was a moment early on when I think there was an honest debate that could be had, and that was in some regard, and that was over the risks of escalation, right? The argument was, how much can the United States, how much support can the US provide to Ukraine? How involved can we become before the risks of getting dragged into that war directly against Russia become so great? That was an honest debate. And that was an honest debate around real policy, right?
Has that question of escalation disappeared?
Oh, I think for the most part. I think that the United States and especially its Western allies have been very skillful in tailoring the aid in such a way as to minimize escalation. And I think the Russians have been very careful also to avoid the kind of actions that could have led to escalation.
Well, because there were questions about the Russians, and I'll just paraphrase, right, saying if you send this kind of weapon, we're going to do this, and then it might then embroil NATO into that question. Have red lines been put out there, crossed, and then ignored in some instances? Maybe not red, but maybe
They haven't been crossed yet. I mean, the Russians are framing this war as a war as Russia. They're not framing it as a war of Russia versus Ukraine. It's a war of Russia versus NATO, right? And so the more NATO weapons, or it looks like NATO is on the field, it's going to play into that sort of discourse that they're using. I would say, I mean, no, the lines haven't been crossed yet, but we haven't seen the F-16s in the field yet, right? I mean, we haven't seen certain things in the field yet. And if the Ukrainians are able to launch a sort of combined air-land assault against Russian lines and use air power specifically to penetrate deeper beyond the front lines, potentially, and this, I think the Americans are going to be very clear about this, where is that line? It's not going to be, you're not going to be able to use your F-16 to bomb Russia itself. Would you be able to use it to bomb Crimea? Well, from the Russian point of view, Crimea is Russia. So what that line becomes is going to be tricky to say. I think the Ukrainians certainly want to be able to use whatever weapon they have to use to defend any and all of their territory. But they have not, there's been some drone attacks across the border, but that's been with Ukraine's own weapons, not something from NATO.
And just to add to the discussion on the U.S. public, I think Ukrainians and Ukrainian leaders themselves understand that this debate inside the United States is not really about Ukraine. I think there's an impression in the United States that almost everything happening globally is about the United States and is somehow very relevant to the United States. And I think a lot of Ukrainians are very bemused when there's talk inside the US about like the risk of us getting involved in the conflict, right? Because the chances of that are so minimal as to be like almost nearly not there. So I think Ukrainians understand that the debate in the US is about American politics, and Ukraine just happens to be kind of in the crosshairs of whatever ideological debates or whatever policy debates there might be ongoing inside the U.S.
When we've talked about this issue before in previous sessions, right? The question of nuclear arms and nuclear and Russia using nuclear weapons has come up, right? And that seems to have disappeared from the conversation, right? Is that an accurate read? And if so, why is that no longer a concern or a threat?
The rhetoric's still there, right? So if you watch Russian television, there's talk of urges by Russian propagandists to, bomb the Baltic states or whatever. So this talk is still there. We've had this discussion before, right? To the Russians, I think nuclear threats in general are primarily a form of propaganda. They're a form of scaring fairly comfortable Western publics who are I think there's a lot of history here with respect to the Cold War. There are all of these anxieties that I think are very easy to rile up. I don't think the Russians are serious about these nuclear threats. I think they perceive them as a way to kind of weaken resolve in the West. I think the risks are negligible. And I don't think, even if we think from a purely rational standpoint, I don't think the Russians are going to be using nuclear weapons or attacking NATO territory or whatever. I mean, they can, they've barely been able to fight the Ukrainian army, right? And we're not even talking about fighting the entire NATO. We're talking about, imagine Russia fighting Poland, which is a fairly sophisticated military power now. I don't think those are necessarily risks that are there.
I was just going to say, as an escalatory threat, it's pretty implausible, right? That's sort of like, taking to paraphrase Spinal Tap, right? That's like turning the knob all the way to 11 from 1, right? If Russia is serious about escalating the war, then there are steps they would take short of that. I mean, I would agree with Christian that this is primarily propaganda that's intended both for domestic Russian, but also more importantly foreign audiences, but isn't really plausible.
So there's always a number of different ways to look at these questions, right? And we are here in Michigan, in the United States, safe and sound, and are watching from afar. But Professor Cantier, you were just in the region, were you not? And does that shed a different light on this conflict? What did you see? What did you notice when you were there?
So I was in Moldova for a few weeks. I have family there. Also managed to visit Romania, right at the Danube. There are a couple of impressions that I have. It's very jarring to witness. I mean, you could see Ukraine across the Danube, so it's a bit jarring to see conflict ongoing, particularly at some of the ports. But it's very interesting to some degree to notice the impact of the European Union and NATO, right? So Romania is a member of both of those organizations. People there are relatively, they're just living their lives without being particularly affected by what is happening. So I think there's, even for some countries that are close to Ukraine, the war is just not necessarily a daily presence. Now, for some other countries like Moldova and even for Poland and some of the Baltic states, I think one of the impacts is kind of has been the impact of refugees, right, and the continuing impact of the humanitarian disaster that the Russian invasion has caused. Now, initially in the first few months, I think in places like Moldova and Romania and Poland, everybody was in a state of emergency to try to house some of these refugees, figure out how to feed them, provide basic health care, and so on. I think now the question becomes one of kind of a long-term management of the refugee crisis. There are also now emerging tensions between some of these countries, primarily the grain export conflicts that we've seen with Poland, with I think Slovakia and a few other countries. Yeah. The general impression is one of relative quiet in NATO and EU territory, which I think speaks to the impact of these organizations and speaks to Ukraine's desire to join them.
So you mentioned a few other countries. We've got a question from our Zoom audience, which is just another reminder that if you're watching on Zoom, you can put a question in. You can put it in the chat. You can put it in Q&A. I'll find it. And but Kevin from Cincinnati is curious about the role of Turkey relative to Ukraine, NATO, and U.S. foreign policy. Can we answer Kevin from Cincinnati's question?
That must be for me. Hi, Kevin from Cincinnati. It's nice to that you're involved with our discussion once again here. Turkey has tried to play a big role in this conflict, kind of in the middle, and it's an aspiring regional sort of power. It has supplied weapons to the Ukrainians, drones specifically have been quite effective. But at the same time, it's importing a lot of its energy needs from Russia. It's actually increased its trade with Russia since the war began. It's tried to broker grain deals just to allow grain to be shipped out of Ukraine through the Black Sea to Asia, Africa, the Middle East, which is important globally. That has fallen apart. Turkey, by the same token, is trying to it's a NATO member, but at the same time, it's not always happy with all its NATO countries and struck a bargain to allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO. I think after the recent election in Turkey there, because of their economic problems primarily, Turkey is turning back, is being a little more cooperative with the West, I would say. Sweden does look like it's going to join NATO. Erdogan does appear to be interested, at least more so rhetorically than in the past, in striking a deal or having better relations with the West. Turkey could play and is trying to play a positive role in terms of at least the grain deal and maybe future mediating the conflict, although we're not quite there yet. So I'm modestly hopeful about Turkey's role there in the Ukraine conflict.
It's pretty striking to me that one thing we haven't talked about is something that started in Russia a couple months ago, I think now. The gentleman that ran the Wagner group, a group of mercenaries, basically, right? Defense contractor, loosely defined, but mercenaries. Is it fair to call what he did tried to start a coup against the Russian government? Is that hyperbolic? And then if you could address what has happened to that gentleman since, I think would be interesting.
He's dead. I guess he didn't stand close enough to a window, so they said instead they brought his whole plane down. No, he got assassinated.
I wanted you to say that, not me.
Yeah. I would say, and Paul and Christian, I think, are closer observers, but to me, this was the closest thing we have seen to an attempted forced change in power since the end of the Cold War, right? Was Prigozhin intending to try to oust Putin and take over the government? I don't think so. I think what he was trying to do was to get a change in the top leadership in the Russian Defense Ministry, which he had essentially accused of undermining his own fighters' efforts. I think he was angling for a bigger role for him, potentially for himself and for his organization. But I don't think he legitimately was threatening to replace Putin.
I mean, you call him a mercenary leader. He's a criminal. He's a war criminal, and he's a criminal in terms of being just a thief, right? I mean, that's what he was. The insurrection that he led, I think, was not directed at Putin or regime change. It was directed at change in personnel and change in Russian policy, which would allow, because they were going to change the way that the relationship between the Russian army and the Wagner group. They wanted to integrate, essentially take Wagner away from him, which would take away his source of income, right? That's what he was after, was to oust these guys that advocated that policy and to allow Wagner to continue to operate independently, or at least that he would continue to get the billions of dollars that he had been able to make off of this particular operation. Interestingly as well, in terms of his assassination, the scuttlebutt is it's that, I mean, you think about it, here's the thing about Russia that I think that we need to sort of understand. I don't know if you've taken a Russian politics class. I don't know if political science really helps you with this. if you understand how the mafia works, you probably have a better idea about how Russia itself works, because it's a mafia state fundamentally. But here's the deal, and you have to kind of, so if you watch The Godfather, it's probably the most useful thing you can do to understand Russian politics. It's a great movie anyway, you should watch it. If you strike a deal with The Godfather really does have some credibility and needs to abide by that deal as well. In other words, this is the interesting part about it to me. If Prigozhin makes his coup and sits down with Putin and says they're going to make up, and you say, well, Putin's going to whack him later anyway, right? And that's just the way it works. No, I think Putin expected Prigozhin to sit in Minsk and Belarus and to just be in a safe house and keep his head down and kind of, just kind of go away. That's not what he did. He went off to Africa to see his Wagner troops. He still wanted a big slice of the pie. He thought he was still a big man, marching around. And for Putin, he wasn't going to tolerate that. So, there goes Prigozhin, maybe out the window, but off of the jet plane, right? At 30,000 feet. It's a mafia state, and he made the deal, it was an insurrection against, it wasn't directed against the Godfather per se, but this sort of deal. And Putin eventually decided he had enough. He was still preening about like to be a pretender to the throne in some ways, and now he's gone. Does that mean Putin is more? I think the question I would ask is Putin more secure in power now, a year and a half into the war, than he was when the war started? Because there were thoughts that, oh, someone's going to go in and get Putin, or the Russians aren't going to tolerate this or whatever. To me, unfortunately, Putin looks pretty secure. The Russians seem cowed. They're not going to raise their heads against this, and there really doesn't seem to be, to the extent there's opposition to Putin, it's more militaristic than the current leadership itself. There certainly is no major voice that's outside of prison calling for an end to the conflict.
The only thing I would add to this is that to some extent it doesn't really matter what happened to him and why. There are a number of different theories, right? And in a way, it kind of reminds me of what historians and political scientists have been trying to do as they tried to investigate what Stalin was doing in the 1930s during the Great Terror, right? So there are a lot of people who were trying to figure out the constellation of people around Stalin, what their intentions were, who was trying to take down Stalin, and so on. To me, I think that this case, like many others, is simply an indicator of both how dangerous Russia is as a member of international society and how unpredictable it is as a member of international society. And the fact that it doesn't have any institutions or any transparency, I think, is quite terrifying when you look at this very powerful state and its involvement in world affairs.
I guess the only other thing that I would add is, while Prigozhin may be gone, Wagner Group is not, and it remains the critical extension of Russian foreign policy and really the linchpin of Russian foreign policy, especially in places like Africa, where they are a dominant force and a dominant influence on behalf of Russia.
All right, so let's switch gears and to go to another Zoom question. Mario on Zoom asked a question that will also be of interest to Dan in Chicago. He asks about the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. He asks specifically about some interesting alignments of supporters of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Could you unpack that a bit for us, and also tell us how those strange, well, there's a saying, right? Politics makes strange bedfellows. Is this another case of that axiom being true?
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, this conflict has been going on for some time. It's really over a contested territory that's internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. It's Nagorno-Karabakh. It's the name of the territory. It's part of Azerbaijan. It's a mountainous enclave within Azerbaijan, but it's historically and currently populated primarily by ethnic Armenians. The Armenians had claimed this as their territory and had Russia offer support to them to kind of able to allow them to carve out sort of a self-governing rule in this area. But Azerbaijan says it's our territory. We want to take it back. Azerbaijan is supported by Turkey. Azeris and Turks share essentially a common language and some would say a very sort of common ethnic background. Turkey's been its big backer politically and militarily. And I think while Russia's been distracted by the war in Ukraine, Turkey has been arming Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has a military superiority over the Armenians and over this small enclave, and has essentially been able to overrun it in the last several days to reassert control over this at great human cost. The Armenians, as you know, the Armenians were subject to a genocide over 100 years ago. The Armenians are talking about a new genocide against the people living there because they've been blockaded and access to food and medical supplies has been extremely limited. But you're seeing Russia, a weakened Russia, unable to support its ally Armenia, and emboldened Turkey supporting Azerbaijan. And I think Armenia has tried to reach out to the West for support, but the West itself is sort of, I don't think Europe and the US considers this sort of central to the, the stakes are that high there, which has sort of allowed Azerbaijan, I think, to prevail, it looks like, in this conflict. Christian, you might have a different take on it, but I don't see the US and Europe being highly involved in this at all.
No, I completely agree with that interpretation. I think it's one of the byproducts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? I think Azerbaijan saw a window of opportunity and is taking that window of opportunity as Russia is kind of distracted in Ukraine. The only thing I would note here historically is that the conflict from a historical perspective can also be traced back to Russian colonialism. The Republic was created with that little enclave inside it as a way for the Soviets to kind of control some of these republics that they took over. So it's an important historical point to kind of keep in mind as we're dealing with another example of kind of Russian colonialism in Ukraine specifically.
And let me just add, first of all, say hello to Dan in Chicago. It's been a long time. Hope you get back to Michigan soon. The last piece I would add sort of ties this in some ways to the war in Ukraine, not politically, but technologically. The last time Azerbaijan and Armenia were involved in a significant military conflict was the debut of drone warfare against armored vehicles. And it was highly successful, so successful that when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was speculation that the age of armor was over, that the ability of drones to knock out armored vehicles would essentially change the face of warfare. And obviously this is not a thing that has happened, but the lesson that was drawn from that last Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict was one that I think requires us to always be cautious before we make grand proclamations about how fundamental any change is going to be when it comes to the role that the technology plays in warfare.
Are there any questions from our audience here in the Oakland Center Winter Garden? Yeah, just say it and I'll repeat it for our folks on Zoom. What role is the U.S. going to play in addressing or fixing the Canada-India kerfuffle?
I think I'm fascinated by this kerfuffle, we can call it that.
Sure, why not?
I'm fascinated by this because Canada usually doesn't cause a kerfuffle in global affairs, right? The U.S., I think, wants to stay out of this as best it can, keep its head down. The U.S. wants to view India as an ally vis-a-vis China in particular. India and China have their own disputes, so it seems like a natural sort of alliance, although I think the Indians would prefer to remain an independent sort of foreign policy, right? Non-aligned, which has a long history in Indian politics. India has been implicitly not sending arms to the Russians, but certainly been more inclined on the Russia side of the conflict. In terms of this specific thing, which I have been following, but we get daily sort of updates. The Canadians shared their intelligence with the United States. The United States has not issued anything to say that the Canadians are wrong in their assessment at all. If anything, they've kind of expressed concerns about what may have occurred. If push comes to shove, and I don't know how far Trudeau wants to push it, I mean, it's an interesting sort of quandary for the United States, right? Do you ally yourself with your great northern neighbor that arguably is our greatest friend in global affairs, an important country to the United States, small, I mean, population-wise small, or do you try to finagle it or hedge your bets and maintain good relations with India, now the largest country in the world by population? It's going to be tough. It could be a really, really tough challenge. What upsets me though about this, I feel like what upsets me is we see bad behavior by states and state leaders frequently, and then it's kind of conveniently forgotten and all is sort of pushed under the rug. The headline story above the fold in the New York Times yesterday is, we're considering signing a mutual defense treaty pact with Saudi Arabia. The same Saudi Arabia that took a Washington Post journalist and dismembered him, chopped him up and whatnot in the Saudi in the consulate in Istanbul. Yet we're dealing with these same people, right? Now you're talking about a leader of the world's largest quote unquote democracy ordering a hit on a Canadian citizen in Vancouver. And it would not surprise me in the next year to see Mr. Modi and Biden make another deal and sort of handshake. And if you got to deal with the devil, you got to deal with the devil, I suppose. But it really upsets me that states behave badly and they get away with it.
So are you really surprised that there's hypocrisy in how, the United States acts? I mean, is that you don't have to answer that, but it's right. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, right? I mean, we conveniently forget about things that we are mad as hell about, and then we count on people forgetting.
With respect to Saudi Arabia specifically, I would only say that given what's happened with global energy and where the future is going with that, and our own commitments to be greener and whatnot, I don't think Saudi Arabia is that significant of a country anymore. And I'm not sure we need to go that far. Yeah, you can deal with the devil from a distance, right? I mean, that's fair enough, but you don't have to give them a big hug.
Fair enough. Now, what's interesting, but I'm glad you mentioned Saudi Arabia, because they're taking another entrance into American and other sort of world cultures. They are buying sports franchises, right?
Sports leagues.
They are buying soccer. They've bought off professional golf, right? I mean, it's really a fascinating tactic by them.
They got to do something with their money. I mean, I wish our colleague Professor Eldridge was here, who studies sovereign wealth funds.
Fair enough.
The vehicle that they're using to exercise this influence.
We're quickly running out of time, and I know some students need to get to their 1 o'clock classes. So I'll ask you one last question real quick. What should the audience pay attention to outside of Russia, Ukraine in the next couple weeks? What should they be on the lookout for in international affairs?
Look out for the Polish elections. Keep track of what's happening in the Sudan and Niger. I would also any election that you can see happening in 2023, 2024, I think is a very good segue into major political issues in international affairs. So anything happening in a large country, I think, is worth following in terms of electoral politics specifically.
So I think that one of the things that I've noticed recently that's going to be worth paying attention to moving forward, we have seen an unprecedented number of climate change driven natural disasters and an inability of countries around the globe, from Europe to the Middle East, in terms of their capability to manage these crises. And I think that that's going to be worth paying attention to as we move forward, right? To what extent will countries around the globe, either separately or together, be able to start to manage what are becoming increasingly disastrous effects?
In addition to the climate issue, I would say I would look out about Biden met yesterday with Netanyahu. I would look at what's going on with Israel, our relations with Israel, maybe trying to broker a peace deal between Israel and the Saudis, which is part of the reason for this defense pact. But additionally, and maybe it's just sort of Schadenfreude or something, just watching the implosion of the British Conservative Party is interesting as well. It's just interesting just to watch how a party that's been in power for so long that made a series of, I think, very poor choices is actually getting punished for it. Which again, it's Schadenfreude. It is Schadenfreude.
If you don't know the definition of that, look it up. It's something that it's a word you should have in your vocabulary. You're right.
It's a word we don't have in English, but we should.
It's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it means to take pleasure in somebody else's misery.
Give them the answer.
Look it up on Google anyway.
Yes, I am anti-technology, Ryan. Yes, I am. And on that note, thank you for coming. Thanks to the folks on Zoom who are watching. Thanks to my colleagues for doing this. Thanks to my friends in the alumni office. Thanks to Ryan and Xander for helping us with the technology that we're using. We've got a great office hours session in October coming up for you on civility, censorship, and social media. So keep an eye out for that one with two colleagues from the Journalism, Communications, and Public Relations Department, I think is what their current title is. So thanks for coming. See you next time for office hours.
Thanks, everybody.